When the bomb went off in Oklahoma, I knew within the first few hours that somebody was lying. Because you know from evidence, from the architecture of the building, the asymmetry in the collapse of the building, the reach of the warhead was absolutely, totally incompatible with 4,000 pounds of ammonium nitrate and fuel oil, or ethanol. So my move was initially, within the first day or two, to get in contact with the senator from Oklahoma's office and try to keep that building from coming down. I knew because they were lying, they would try to cover it up, and they would bring the building down and bury it as quick as they possibly could, or get rid of it, dispose of it. And so I went to Senator Nichols' office, and his assistant, who was handling things for Oklahoma, said he would check it out, see what he could do. I was trying to get him to get the Oklahoma National Guard to do an independent investigation. And 2 days later, he said, well, he talked to the people, and there's a lot of difference of opinion in Oklahoma with respect to what happened. And from that comment, I decided he was going to do nothing, so I turned out a technical report and sent it to 75 senators and congressmen who had very good voting records. And essentially, it was a black hole. Most of them sent the report to the FBI for their information and action. One senator wrote a letter back and said, I've withdrawn my report, my support for the counterterrorism bill, and we'll see to it that it is cleaned up before it gets through. But the reaction was pretty much like a black hole. As you know, they went ahead and took the building down and physically buried it. It was physically buried. There's the Murrah building. This is the transfer beam. It goes across the front. The building is roughly 70 feet this way and 200 feet this way. The street is going slightly uphill, and in the middle of the building it is level with the sidewalk. Down here the first floor is above the sidewalk, and on this end of the building the floor is below the level of the sidewalk. And you have a little planter that goes across, all the way across the building from one end to the other. And that little planter is very flimsy. It's very little reinforcement in it. It's a planter wall. And I'll show you later the damage, and you see it's still standing, so there's a lot of phoniness about what had happened down there. If you look at the other side of the building, there wasn't an awful lot of damage. And I know the architect. I talked to the architect who was responsible for advising the shoring up crew about the building, and he had suggested that the people down there, they ought to really rebuild the building because it was rebuildable. You could tear a lot of it away, but a lot of it was still in very good shape. The elevator tower, and he said didn't have a crack on it. But he said the mayor of Oklahoma called him and said, it's my position that the building should be brought down as soon as possible, and I want you to back me up on it. And he said, by the way, that's the governor's position also. Team number 5 in the rescue operation put this sign on the building across the street, the Journal Records building, and said, we search for the truth. We seek justice. The courts require it. The victims cry for it. And God demands it. The courts require it as a lie. Absolute lie. They've participated in all kinds of cover. Now, Charles Key, when I saw what was happening, and I went to Senator Nichols' office, and they weren't going to do anything. I got the report out, I put a technical report out, and sent to 75 senators and congressmen, and it was almost a black hole. And then Charles Key had gotten a hold of that report, and he invited me down to Oklahoma, and to give my analysis of what had happened, and all the members of the Oklahoma Assembly were invited to attend. Only a few attended. All the family members, surviving family members, were invited to attend. Quite a few of them attended, and it was held in the assembly room of the state legislature. And while I was there, we went out and we looked at a lot of things, and Charles Key filed to get the effort to get the county grand jury underway because actually the governor vociferously opposed having the legislature, and he lobbied strongly against having the legislature look into it. And we had a press conference, and some government official there did his best to put words in their mouth which I hadn't said. He's trying to say, well, that Ben Partin says the government destroyed the building. No, I didn't say that. I said, we know who's covering it up, but we know who destroyed it. At that time, we did not. If you have a minimum amount, and when you implode a building, you use a minimum amount of explosive, because these are done in populated areas normally. And so what you do is you drill a hole into a column and put a little piece of explosive in there, less than, say, a pound or more. And you tamp it, and you run a squib in, and you connect them up with primacord or electronic timing, and you set them off in a sequence to make the building collapse the way you want it to. And it doesn't take very much explosive buried in the column, because the pressure when that explosive goes off is several hundred times the yield strength of the concrete. So it just turns an area around that explosive into dust and leaves a structure there with nothing but the rebar. You don't do anything to the rebar because it's embedded in the concrete, and when a wave of plastic deformation moves through, a wave of deformation through the concrete, it just turns it to dust, and you can blow it away. Now, when the building started imploding, all those little pieces of explosive in the columns, you see, you generate all that white dust, because the wave of deformation, it doesn't deform very easily. But when it moves through the rebar, the reinforcement rods, they're plastic. And if you want to tell what has happened to where a piece of rebar has been exposed to high explosive or high detonation velocity explosives, you can take and make a photomicrograph of it and see the grain changes in the rebar, and very easily determine what had happened. Now, as the building was being collapsed, you probably, with less than 200 pounds of explosive in all those little charges, you probably had several thousand pounds of that dust that was created. That's why you had some of the children and people in there, they were so laden, heavily laden with this dust, they're almost unrecognizable. The pressure from, say, we're out here where it had been 500 to 700,000 pounds per square inch where the explosive went off, by the time you got to the first point of contact of this column, the pressure would have been down to about 385, 90 pounds. And that's enough when you can load structures to get failure, but you cannot get the kind of failure, what you call Broussard's failure, where the stuff turns to powder. You cannot get any of the Broussard's damage, but there's a lot of Broussard's damage in the building. So you know, there were demolition charges inside the building. Now, if you look here, you brought down this column over here where the pressures were, what, 30 pounds or so. You're talking about bicycle pressure, top pressures, bicycle tire pressures. Now, if you could just on a basis of logic, if you could take down this column and this column and this column, and you could reach out to here and take this column down, certainly you would have been able to take down all of these columns, which are much smaller. This column is about 36 inches by 22, with about 20 pieces of rebar, which were 1 3/4 inches in diameter. A massive, massive structure. And these were about 22 inches square back in here. So if you could have taken this column down, you should have taken all these down, but they're still standing. Secondly, if you could have taken this one out, you should have been able to take this one out. And you had about 40%, 42% more impulse here than you had here. This one came down and those are still standing. You can't have that kind of a symmetry because the pressure distribution is very, very symmetrical from that kind of a warhead going off. Now, you can do some things to focus explosive charges, but when you don't, with say a shape charge, you can put your copper liner on one side and get a focus beam and get energy to go out some distance. But when you just take explosives and try to shape them within 2 or 3 charge diameters, any directionality, most of the directionality is going to disappear. In at least 4 or 5 diameters, it'll disappear. Now, the Federal Emergency Management Administration, the people who will become your government if the President declares emergency, in conjunction with the American Society of Civil Engineers, turned out this report to try to refute the report that I had turned out. And they really muddled it up in a very bad way. It's a free report. Anybody wants to write to call FEMA, they'll send you this report. It's about over 1/4 inch thick, beautiful color all the way through. It's a propaganda piece. It's free. If it wasn't a propaganda piece, you'd have to pay for it. Now, if you look at what the trial was all about, Nichols, if you take, the FEMA report said they took the FBI figures for the size of the crater, which was 28 feet across, 6.8 feet deep. And said to generate a crater that size, it would require 4,000 pounds of TNT. TNT is a standard, sort of a standard measure against which you measure everything else. So it would have taken 4,000 pounds of TNT. And these areas are proportional to weights. So if this is 4,000 pounds of TNT, it would have taken 14,800 pounds of AFNO to give you the same blast equivalence in a 2.5-ton truck. So that's just totally incompatible. Now, this chart shows the building as it was cleaned up before they permitted the defense counsels to go through with their technical experts. All the evidence had been removed. You see, this column back in here, this is the second row of columns, 35 feet from the front. All the columns from the front had been removed down to the stub, into the ground. And the same thing, this one back in the middle is gone, but it was standing up here to the third floor. I'll show you in a few seconds. And here is the second floor. This is all the air conditioning unit, but on the second floor from here over to the other side is where all the children were in that nursery. The ATF had their weapons arsenal up in the top, and their offices up there. Here is the top. See the rebar? 3 of those 1 3/4-inch rebars come all over here, and here's the top. It was up in the transfer beam, right at this end. Well, it's red, and when you cold work steel in a demolition charge, with a demolition charge, you cold roll it, or you cold work it, it gets very hot, you remove most of the protective coatings, and it'll rust very, very quickly. Now you can see that is already turning brown. It's not turned brown anywhere else, but it was apparently cold work to me. All of this is structural failure from all the floors hammering down one after another, coming from fairly great heights. If you look at the way this collapsed, the next column over collapsed pretty much the same way. Now the FEMA, and I'll show you, it collapsed pretty much the same way. And FEMA said that the next column over was destroyed by Broussons, and nobody really seen it. It had just really turned to dust and disappeared. Well, all the rebar would have still been there, right? Now, there's something very peculiar about craters. When you have a truckload of explosives going off on concrete or asphalt, you have something that is very characteristic. You see, here you have, this is a picture in London of a truck bomb, and you have this shelf sticking out over the hole, because when the bomb goes off, you can ram this clay and dirt way down below back. I wouldn't say it's compressive, but you do move it back. It's plastic. And you can't move it back like you do the concrete. So the rim of the concrete and asphalt always sticks out over the hole. And in the crater that you see in Oklahoma, you don't have it. Now, there's something else very significant. This place is the closest point to the transfer beam and to the column. That column A5 is still covered here. But you see the transfer beam, and this is the bottom of the beam that would have been looking right down at that truck. Do you see any fall or damage on the bottom of that beam? Or over here? That's probably the closest point you would find to that truck. Now here is really the telltale evidence. Here is column A5. So they cut off the rebars, been cut off. That's what they did in getting rid of all this stuff in the cleanup process. There's column B4. B4. And this is the second floor level. Second floor level. So this is down below the second floor level. Now, this is the closest point of contact to where they said the truck was. Do you see any spall? Do you see any Broussons? It's not even spall. So something came down and covered that before the truck bomb went off. Now, you know, there's a tremendous amount of witnesses, and I'm not going into all that, but there's so many witnesses who testified that of all the rumbling and the shaking of the building and the rolling of the floors, several seconds before the blast went off that blew in all the glass. Now, here's A7, which came down out toward the street. You can see the kind of damage you have. That's the kind of damage you'd get from a small demolition charge. It's not the kind of damage you get from a Broussons, from a big charge. It's a small, localized demolition charge kind of a thing. Now, we know that they pulled out 3 5-gallon cans of fulminated mercury, which is a booster And you can tie that together with primacord without doing anything else, and primacord will set that off because it is a booster material. 3 5-gallon tank cans they were pressure sensitive. We had pressure sensitive fuses on them that failed to go. There's also testimony. I talked to the individual who reported that and saw that personally. There was also a 2-foot by 2-foot by 2-foot box that had a fuse system on it to go off 10 minutes after the others, and it was taken out. And one of these devices was taken out of the building, and this is a device that was designed specifically. It's a standard military unit to take out bridge piers, railroad bridge piers or major piers. And you can see it's only a 35-pound device, but you have a shape charge with a follow-through charge, which goes in and blows up, and that's the kind of damage you can get to a very, very large pillar. And that small device would have done the job. When I went to Oklahoma and testified before the grand jury, I was asked for some more information before they really called me down there, and I sent them about 2 inches worth of material, and I put a long letter on it. And the judge who was over that grand jury down there when it was set up, he said, this was in the August 97 Media Bypass magazine, states the following: Judge Burkett told the grand jurors not to accept hearsay. Hearsay evidence is permitted in grand jury hearings. How else do you identify the people who you want to call as witnesses? And that charge was illegal because Oklahoma law authorizes you to call in the use hearsay evidence in identifying witnesses. Only those witnesses who would present facts which, if true, would substantiate an indictable offense and not needlessly delay the courts in other functions by listening to radical persons or facts about which you could do nothing even if they were true. So in the report that I sent back, I suggested that they under no conditions except any judicial restrictions, that they did not appeal. When TAB-800 was shot down, the FBI said, we have recovered all 4 engines, and none of them showed missile damage, therefore the aircraft was not brought down by a missile. Now, your IR missiles may have a CEP of something on the order of 3 feet, or 10 feet or less. But when you're dealing with all-weather guidance systems, which you would normally use, you like to take care of things on an all-weather basis, you're talking about accuracies 10 times that, maybe 30, 35, 40 feet. So what kind of a warhead infusing system can you use to decisively destroy that target instantaneously? The 747 is a very large aircraft. You send up, it could be hit in many, many places with a small IR missile and not bring it down. You know, 007 was hit by 2 of those missiles and had a very controlled descent. Now, if you hit an aircraft with a blast frag missile, you may punch a bunch of holes in it, and you're using proximity fuses. You'll punch a bunch of holes in it, but you won't get a decisive kill. And it may fly another 10, 15, or 20, or minutes or half hour, and be over target and destroy the target, and you've wasted your time. So we developed the continuous rod warhead to give you a decisive, instantaneous structural kill. And it's the only warhead that will do that. And unless you have a hit, and when you have all-weather guidance, you generally don't hit it. You come in close proximity because the skin is stressed on that aircraft. It's stiffened by stiffeners, but there's not much mass there. Actually, in the aircraft, it did not cut through the top of the aircraft, but it cut through the bottom. So what happened? When that warhead went off down there, you got some blast damage. It was in close enough to give you some blast damage. There's dimpling between the stringers all along here. When you cut through, the airplane had about 5 pounds per square inch pressurization at that altitude. So if you integrate that 5 pounds per square inch across that whole cross-section of the fuselage, you had really like 2 30-foot rocket nozzles with 5 pounds of pressure pushing both those pieces apart with about 1 million pounds of force instantly. And so with all that force, this would have separated very, very quickly, which it did, And actually, this section here weighed about 100,000 pounds. So if you had 1 million pounds across there, the instantaneous pressure that front section saw would have been about 10 G's shuffling it apart. And you would have had less than that going back because of the mass back there. But there's an awful lot of evidence that shows what happened. Now, the FBI went to the CIA and got them to do a simulation, and they showed this on movies, and I'm sure all of you saw it, and it's nonsense. They showed it off climbing to a certain altitude and going through a little phugoid motion and going way ahead. But an airplane is flying in a very balanced condition. You have the weight of the front and the weight of the back balanced across the fulcrum, which is the center of lift on the wing. It's just like a seesaw with two kids on a teeter-totter. When one jumps off, what happens to the other one? He bumps his bottom, right? So the same thing happens when that front end of the aircraft was cut off. The back end rotated down very violently. So you had the equivalent of 100,000 pounds off here on a fulcrum maybe 30 feet long or 40 feet. So there's no way the airplane didn't have enough control surface capability to give it that kind of a downward pull on the tail. It was losing the front end and the bottom just dropped down. Now when the warhead cut through, it cut through just into the leading edge of the wing and got into the right fuel tank. And it started burning very quickly, and it cut into the front section of the main fuel tank also. But the first action was not the blowing up of the fuel tank. The first action was cutting that aircraft in two. Now, there's just so many dozens and dozens of technological things that we could spend a long, long time talking about. You want to turn that off for a second. Now, we know that I'm just talking here about the things with there's witnessable effects that you can see from the bomb damage assessment. We know a tremendous amount about what happened. A submarine was being tracked all the way from the St. Lawrence Seaway down, and they lost it there in the New York Bay. I was given this information very, very, very quickly after this thing happened. Major Fritz Myers, there were over 250 people who saw the missile intercept. And the FBI said, and the NTSB both, that all these people saw was what happened after the fuel tank blew up. But you had 250 people there, and probably the most competent observer of the whole thing was Major Fritz Myers. He was a helicopter pilot. He was headed straight out toward the aircraft. There was a traffic pattern. Additional traffic had been reported at the twilight conditions, and he was busily scanning, trying to find the other aircraft. It was reported in the traffic pattern, and he was looking straight out and saw the whole thing happen. He saw the missile go up from the surface, arched, went up, made a correction to the left, and a little down a little bit, and it blew up with that very, very white, intense flash. And then you saw what happened, the thing subsequent to that. There was another flash from the tank blowing, and there was another flash, not a flash as much as the whole thing erupted in a burning mass coming down. But Major Fritz Myers, I've been through his testimony and his comments personally with him over and over, and there's no question in my mind he knew what he saw. He had seen many missile intercepts going in rescue operations up in North Vietnam, and he's a very competent observer with a lot of experience. Who did it? I don't know. The story was put out in the press. Press made a big push on it. It was Pierre Salinger's story about it was friendly fire. Well, that story had been on the internet for many months before the Pierre Salinger came out with his point. Christopher Story, he was the editor and publisher of Soviet Analyst. Can the Soviets destroy a U.S. passenger airliner and get away with it? Do the American authorities know at the highest level that TWA Flight 800 was destroyed by a missile or missiles launched from a submarine off Long Island, and are they prepared to cover up this act of war? And he went on to say that a day or two after the shoot down of TWA 800, they had the G7+1 meeting scheduled in Europe. And in that meeting, because of the TWA 800 shoot down, they changed the agenda to a terrorism or counterterrorism meeting and also a meeting against organized international crime. And in that meeting, they agreed to have a free exchange of information on all terrorist and counter-terrorist activities and organized crime activities among the G7+1. The one is Russia. And according to Christopher Story, he said they would have never risked. It was so important to open the files of the FBI and CIA on all this information that they would have never risked a ragtag terrorist group doing it. They would have controlled it themselves. Is that true? I don't know. But I do know that Pierre Sumner's story was traced back to Moscow 10 days after the shoot down of TW-800. Let's talk about Waco a couple of minutes. I was asked by the chief investigator of a civil case dealing with Waco. I was asked to do a forensic on the church records vault. Now, you probably haven't heard anything about the church records vault at Waco, but when they started the assault on the compound there at Waco, and this was the second assault, at 6 o'clock in the morning, there was an aircraft sitting up there overhead at 6,000 feet with an infrared system looking down throughout the operation. And about 12:30, they started this all at 6 o'clock in the morning, and about 12:30, it was burned down. How many of you in here have seen the movie that was made, Rules of Engagement? Okay, quite a few of you. This information you'll see, they're coming out with Waco 2, Rules of Engagement. And you'll find this information in that Waco 2. This will be out. The ground floor of this little 3-story building here is what they call the church records vault. It's a reinforced concrete structure. It was designed for keeping the church records, but they had turned it into storage of food, and one end was for storage of food, the other end was a refrigerator unit. And it had one door of entrance. And you see this tank went straight through the building, blocking through this passageway, and pushed all the stuff in the kitchen up against that exit. But you see the tanks had been penetrating all around, and in the back, here's a tank here had been penetrating in the back. And in the rules of engagement, they showed small arms fire, automatic weapon fire into the buildings they're pushing in. And here you have all these stacked weapons up against the wall. Now you got a weapon against a weapon against a weapon, and there's a hole from the gases, and you stick a half a dozen F-16s blasting down through there, and you got guns against the wall stacked against another. You know, it's kind of hard to do that to get those to stand up. You ever try to lean again against the wall, and another one on top of that, and another one on top of that? And all this stuff is piled over against the wall, so that room was definitely prepped for that photograph. Something else. I think it's far, far more important than what I've been talking about, but it's all part of the same thing. And this really deals with the world program of the Communist International. And when I talk about this, you're going to see how all these bombings tie together and where they play in the implementation of that program. And that's one of my main interests for sticking my nose into this and fighting it as much as I have, because I see the bigger picture in which this plays, and we've got to stop it. And it's a program to transform every square inch of the world into this global world system. And if you look at the end game of what George Bush called the New World Order, or what people call globalism, and the end game of the Third International, they are one and the same. Now, we have a number of disinformation programs. From 1955 to 1988, the number one disinformation program in the world is the Sino-Soviet split. So the Sino-Soviet conflict, that's the fight between Russia and China, was the key disinformation program. And in the book that I wrote, I said is one of the highest payoff strategies they have ever implemented to effect the implementation of their program. Now, from 1992 to the present, the number one propaganda front out there, the disinformation program, is that communism is dead. How many of you in here believe communism is dead? I don't see any hands. Now, when the bomb went off in Oklahoma, President Clinton said, who was responsible? The generators of hate. Who are the generators of hate? The Christian right. Talk show hosts. Probably me indeed. And the Christian right and the talk shows and the militia were the real bad guys. So the generators of hate, we knew who the administration said they were. And they've been undergoing an effort to try to modify things in this country to change the target population. And I'll get into that a little later. Now, there's also a lot of forbidden information out there by the media. And the media have been organized continuously for the last couple of hundred years. And this goes way, way back. Now, forbidden information. We've heard a lot about collective security, trying to move NATO into Western Europe. One of the stated, declared chief objectives of the communist world for many years has been to establish a global collective security system. And they've been talking about a collective security system. It reaches from Halifax in Canada to the Sakhalin Islands, the other side of China, and bring this all together in a collective security system. And NATO is now a functional part of NATO. Of the United Nations. So when you bring a collective security system that includes the whole of East and West Europe and Russia and China, where's the center of gravity? And from the very beginning of communism, one of the major payoffs that they were after was to establish, one, to eliminate private property, to establish a global government system, global hierarchy of government, establish sexual license. You don't hear much about that. Well, that was one of the other big payoffs that they were after. And a few other key ones, but there are many, many, many things that are involved in that program. But they called it back then the anti-Christian conspiracy because their target number one was to destroy Christianity in specific, in all religions in general. And Voltaire said, I will destroy Christianity if it takes 1,000 years. And a lot of the things that they did and set up program-wise were designed to accomplish that over 1,000-year time. Now this is the means of things that they had vowed to do in implementing their program to establish this world communist system. And the first item on their list, the first item is the total subjugation of public opinion and the annihilation of the faith of all Christian nations. And there's a whole bunch of others. But the first thing is the control of public opinion. And we have that going on today. And the mainline media in this country is up to their ears in the control of public opinion. I was more interested in the military was the transformation processes that they were using to transform a country from freedom and independence into the socialist camp. And I'll touch on that, but there were many other strategies that were implemented. For instance, the program called for the establishment of a global environmental program. Who heads up the global environmental program today? Gorbachev. And you have the Gorbachev Foundation at Presidio, but that's just the local U.S. branch. The main Gorbachev Foundation is in Moscow. And there are Gorbachev Foundations in many of the developed nations in the world. And they called it the New World Order. There are many, many places in that program where they call it the New World. Secondly, one of the primary systems for transforming countries was what they call wars of national liberation. And here is another document which is thicker than this one that covers the strategy and tactics for a war of national liberation. Castro took Cuba in a war of national liberation. They have a war of national liberation scheduled for the United States. There are many different strategies of what they do, but just in the transforming process of taking a country A into the getting rid of the government and bringing it in as a socialist independent state before this year 2000 and now 2005, they broke the world down into three different kinds of countries based on their vulnerabilities. And the first group they considered the capitalist countries, which is Western Europe, Australia, and Japan. And these countries were all to be transformed into socialism by democratic processes. Fabian socialism and democratic processes. You can subvert and infiltrate the government, the legislative process, and at a certain time do things, which I'll talk about, to force them into the socialist camp. The second group of countries was the countries at the medium level of development, which is all Eastern Europe. And they had a very definite strategy there. They started trying to pick those countries up out in the 30s. Some of them fell into communism. They couldn't hold them, and then they fell back. And I guess one of the last ones they were trying to take was Finland, and Finland, gave them a very hard time. But Poland, the Poldovsky affair, Poland fell, and then they were able to regain themselves. But all of those countries transitioned to socialism as a consequence of World War II. But the rest of the world, which was most of the world, was all to be transformed by, they call them colonial and semi-colonial countries, the rest of the world, and they're all to be transformed to socialism by what they call a war of national liberation. Now, after World War II, a number of wars of national liberation were in the preparatory phase, but at the end of World War II, Churchill and Stalin and Roosevelt were very anxious to move these countries that they gained their independence as a consequence of World War II, put them back under their own self-rule before they were really ready for it. And Stalin was very happy to do that because he knew it would help them move those countries into socialism. And they came up with another process which they call they took all these countries and they called them countries. These countries they brought up by a new strategy which they call the block within strategy. The first place they applied it was in Egypt, and Nasser was the agent for that. And they went through a definite process, which is all spelled out. And then in the Party Congress in Moscow in 1960, they adopted that block within strategy to be applied in other countries where that pattern fit. And the first place it would happen was as I indicated, was in Egypt. Not in Egypt, but yeah, it was Egypt. Farouk was on his own. It was the first place they transitioned. The second that transitioned by the block within strategy was Iraq. And to consider Saddam Hussein anything but another Castro is kind of folly. Now, a war of national liberation. I know I'm right up against the wall, but I want to hit two or three more things. The phase zero, for a war of national liberation, you go through a phase zero, which is you define the basis for the revolutionary struggle. What struggle, internal struggle in every country of every one of these countries where you're going to have a war of national liberation, what is the internal schism on which you can base a revolutionary struggle? In Ireland, it was a Protestant versus a Catholic. In Canada, it's the French separatist movement. In the United States, it's racial. The racial groupings are the blacks, the Chicanos, American Indians, and some Oriental conclaves. And in Rwanda, it was the Hutu versus the Tutsi. It was also the Christian versus the witchcraft people. In the Sudan today, it's the black Christian in the south against the Muslims in the north. Now, you go through the first phase, which they call the first phase of the preparatory phase. It's nonviolent. You exacerbate the conflict thesis until you're ready to move that country into the next phase, which is the period of escalating violence. And there are two things you always try to do before you move to the period of escalating violence. You try to, number one, remove the death penalty, because if people get involved in revolutionary struggles and they get caught in terrorist activities, they can be executed. If you remove the death penalty, you get rid of that threat. So the only thing they have to fear is being locked up, and that's no fear at all, because when the revolution goes to completion, they have the hopes of becoming another Mandela or a Castro, and so they have nothing really to fear because they'll get out of jail. The third period, the second thing they always try to do before they move into the period of escalating violence is to disarm the people. Lenin said, and he said several 100,000 businessmen and professionals and industrialists are no threat to a revolution. But 10 million armed and independent farmers are a terror to revolution. Now, they have got to disarm the American people before they move to the next step, the period of escalating violence. Well, they tried to do it with the counterterrorism legislation. They did a certain amount with the Brady Bill. But they're still working at it. And you're going to find more terrorist activities and more things to establish a public outcry to disarm the American people. In Australia, one guy went out and killed, and it was a very planned, deliberated thing, to go to the most opportune place to do it, where you had a lot of people who had guns and do some terrible, killed a bunch of people. And in 3 months' time, they had the legislation through, and they were out there moving to disarm the people in Australia, and they've already done it. And now you got some guys saying it's 20 years if they find you with a gun, but still a lot of people in Australia, well, the PVC, 6-inch PVC pipe in Australia disappeared. After that, very recently, last year I think, Scotland, you had the same thing that happened in Scotland. And one guy went out and killed a whole bunch of people. They got a legislation through immediately and have disarmed Scotland. England has been disarmed all along. Most of Europe has been disarmed. And the United States they're working on that before they can move us to the period of escalating violence. Listen, before we move to the next big step in their efforts, there were three things they were going to do to get influence the United States out of Western Europe. You have the European community now, and you have a new axis between France and Germany and Russia. You don't hear much about it, but there is a new agreement between all three of those countries. So you get the United States influence, get the control of the last big choke point, which they can't control, was to control South Africa and the mineral resources of South Africa. You now have South Africa is clearly in the communist camp. And they're using South Africa now to move and consolidate the revolutions in the rest of Africa. Within the last year, the Congo has been reconsolidated by an old long-term communist. Namibia is an old long-term communist. And the Congo is Zaire. They've taken over Zaire and combined with the old Congo. It's now called the Congo again. So they're still consolidating country after country after country. And we're sitting back here fat, dumb, and happy and paying no attention to it. But then the third thing was to get control of the oil in the Middle East. And I'll tell you this, Saudi Arabia is our big source of oil from the Middle East, is, I dare say, setting a certain amount of jeopardy. The population, the working force, is mostly foreign in Saudi Arabia. And the number of people that they have in Saudi Arabia is very, very small. And you have Yemen surrounded the south, is communist controlled. And what is going to happen to pull a coup or something in Saudi Arabia, I'm very fearful that you're going to see something happen there before too long. I tried to find out when they set up perestroika. I knew they would change the name or do something or to get rid of the International Department because it was inimical with what they were claiming to be doing. And I finally found that they changed the name of the ECCI, or the International Department, to the Gorbachev Foundation. And when I was talking with that interview, I said with that Russian official, I asked him if this was true. Yeah, all the way through. And then I asked him, is this now true? Is the Gorbachev Foundation, are they sitting there as a catbird orchestrating the effort external to the Soviet Union? And he said, well, I'll have to get back with you on that. He didn't want to make that positive statement. He said, but I'll tell you this. The Gorbachev Foundation is building a 1 kilometer square brand new office complex in Moscow. He said, I don't know where they're getting the money, but they're well funded. I said, I'll tell you where they're getting the money from. They're getting the money from the Fortune 500. There are a lot of other things that we could talk about, I would like to talk about, but we have got to wind things up and go to lunch. So I will stop at this particular point, and if we have any opportunity later, we can talk about what we need to do about it, but for the time being, I thank you for your time and for your attention.
Good to see you.